Good. So I want to begin today with concluding Aristotle Part 3. Before I do, however, could I just ask the people? Yes, thank you so much. And your neighbor too. Would you mind? Thank you so much. Just out of respect to Mr. Aristotle. It's Mr. to you. I want to talk today about Aristotle's discovery of America. This will probably come as a surprise to some of you, that Aristotle discovered America. But I will get to that in a minute. In many ways for Aristotle, as it is for every student of politics, the most serious, the most difficult issue one confronts is the problem of faction. How to control for factions, how to control for conflict between factions. And that is the issue addressed especially in books 4 and 5 of the Politics, where Aristotle goes on to describe by the term polity the regime that he believes most successfully controls for the theme of faction. The essential feature of this regime, the polity, which in fact he gives the name politeia, the generic, you might say, Greek word for regime. The polity is the regime that represents, for Aristotle, a mixture of the principles of oligarchy and democracy. And therefore, he says, avoids dominance by either extreme. By combining elements, as it were, of the few and the many, polity is characterized by the dominance of the middle class, the middle group. And the middle class, he says, is able to achieve the confidence of both extreme parties, where at least it is sufficiently numerous to avoid the problems of class struggle and factional conflict. Where the middling element is great, Aristotle writes, factional conflicts and splits over the nature of regimes occur least of all. So Aristotle, in a way, has discovered, long before James Madison's famous article in Federalist number 10, the remedy for the control and containment, so to speak, of faction. You remember, for many of you, if not all of you, who have read the 10th Federalist paper, that Madison outlines a scheme for an extended republic, he says, where numerous factions in many ways check and balance one another, compete with one another, and therefore avoid the dominance of a single faction, leading to the kind of tyranny of the majority, the tyranny of a majority class. And Aristotle's proposal for a mixture of oligarchy and democracy seems in many ways to anticipate 2,000 years before the fact Madison's call for a government where powers must be separated, and where he says in Federalist 51, ambition must be made to counteract ambition in order to avoid, in other words, the extremes of both tyranny and civil war. So the inevitable conclusion that I reach, and I believe any sensible reader of Aristotle would reach, is that Aristotle, in fact, discovered the American Constitution 1,500 or 2,000 years before it was written. This may seem surprising to you, since, of course, Aristotle lived long before, but that may simply be our own prejudice to think that. My friend at the CUNY Graduate Center, Peter Simpson, has argued in a paper that I found quite convincing that Aristotle had in fact discovered the American Constitution. And in fact, I say it may simply be our prejudice that he didn't. Aristotle writes in Book 2 of the Politics that the world is eternal and everything in it has been discovered. The earth experiences, he says, certain periodic destructions and cataclysms. Civilizations are reduced to barbarism, only to recover and grow again. If this theory, you might say, of sort of cataclysmic change is true, we cannot rule out the possibility that a constitution like ours, or even identical to ours, existed at some point in the ancient past, in the far distant past, that Aristotle knew about. Do you think that's possible? Well, why not? But Aristotle's mixed constitution differs from ours still in certain important respects. Aristotle understands the mixed constitution as a balance of classes, the one, the few, and the many. He doesn't so much insist, as you will see in your reading, on the actual separation of functions of government, putting them into separate hands. It is enough for him, he says, if each class shares in some aspect of the governing power. But that leads to a further difference. We tend to think of the separation of powers doctrine as necessary for the security and liberty of the individual, don't we? We usually think of individual freedom and security as the purpose of the separation of power. It is when political functions become concentrated into the hands of, again, the too few hands, that we risk arbitrary government and the endangerment to the liberty of the individual. But for Aristotle, it is not the liberty of the individual so much as the functioning or functional well-being of the city that is the highest priority. Individual freedom may be at best a desirable byproduct of the Aristotelian mixed regime, but individual freedom is not its defining or principal goal. And for anyone interested in this difference, I suggest you contrast or compare Aristotle's account of mixed government to Book 11 of Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, or to some of the Central Federalist Papers, to see the way in which Mr. Aristotle revised, in some ways, the wisdom of Madison. And you could compare them in some way that I think would be valuable. But not only did not only did Aristotle understand the importance of the separation of powers doctrine and the kind of balance of factions as a way of controlling conflict and struggle, but he also understood the importance of property and private property and commerce for a flourishing republic. We didn't really pause to talk much about this, but in Book 2, you remember, he criticizes at considerable length Plato's Republic for the excessive unity it demands of its citizens, and Socrates' demands for common ownership of property, at least among the auxiliary class. But Aristotle claims that the city is not naturally one. That is to say, a certain diversity is necessary to make up a city. Where all property is held in common, it is more likely to suffer from common neglect than it is from common ownership. And he clearly understands, in many ways, the virtues of private property and of commerce. It is evident, he says, Aristotle writes, that as it becomes increasingly one, as it becomes increasingly unified, the city, it will no longer be a city. For the city is in its nature a multitude, and as it becomes more of a unity, it will be like a household instead of a polis, and a human being instead of a household. So there we see in Book 2 Aristotle offering his criticism of the claims for the sort of excessive unification of centralization, concentration of property. And yet, despite his awareness of the importance of commerce and the importance of property, the aim of the city, he tells us, is not wealth, is not the production of wealth. In that way, it would be useful to make a contrast between Aristotle and someone like Adam Smith, the great author of The Wealth of Nations. If wealth were the purpose of politics, Aristotle writes, the Phoenicians You might say in the ancient world, the Phoenicians were the commercial people par excellence. The Phoenicians would be the best regime. But he denies that. Aristotle could never endorse the view stated by a famous American president that the business of America is business. The political partnership, he says, must be regarded for the sake of noble acts performed well. Wealth, property, he tells us, exists for the sake of virtue, not virtue for the sake of wealth. And just as Aristotle would have been critical of the American tendency to regard government as for the sake of business or for the sake of the economy, he also criticized beforehand the American tendency to organize into clubs, what we call political parties, which exacerbate rather than control political conflict. These political clubs or parties use their influence to incense the populace, using their power to whip up dangerous passions that tend to make American politicians closer to demagogues than to statesmen. He would also regard the peculiar American practice of elections rather than the Greek practice of appointing political offices by lot. He would regard elections as merely exacerbating the tendency to demagoguery, where each person seeking office plays shamelessly to the mob, promising all manner of things that they know they will not and cannot deliver. Think of almost anybody you like. And furthermore, while the regime, the American regime in many ways, is in principle open to all and prides itself